Jordan Peterson restored men's desire to be intellectuals. Andrew Tate restored men's desire to have ambition. I don't know that we're going to have one man that's going to lead anything. I look at Rome, the Roman Empire. Once it grew large enough, fractured off into mini capitals.
Unfortunately, the system that we inhabit promotes polarization. And this is what Andrew Tate did, right? He did something very smart in the sense that he would take a fundamental truth about the masculine experience and then couch it in something inflammatory.
Usually, it was a complete slump, at least, until one guy picked up the axe or just charged screaming into battle like William Wallace style.
We have a real absence of male role models. You have 1 in 4 kids growing up without a father figure.
I don't care where you're from. I don't care who you choose to sleep with. I don't care who you choose to vote for. I don't care what you choose to eat. What is the purpose? What is the point of you being here, and what are you trying to accomplish?
Today we're talking to Connor Beaton, the creator of Man Talks podcast. And if you haven't heard the Man Talks podcast, I don't know what rock you've been living under. But if you're a man in this modern world, you need to hear Connor talk about facing your shadow. And that's exactly what we're covering here today. Connor, I wanted to bring you on today so that we could talk about the shadowy aspect of masculinity. We talk on this podcast a lot about how much we love masculinity, and other people out there in the world talk about how much they hate masculinity. And I think your unique angle that you bring is that there's the man and then there's the shadow that is cast. And I have this idea that I've just begun forming that our shadows have never quite been as distorted maybe as they are today. Our shadows have, we have so many different lights aimed at us in so many different directions that men have almost too many shadows now to even collate and bring together. I would love to pick your brain here today a little bit. Share with us, for the men at home who are just beginning to take their steps out of that cave and see the light and realize that their shadow is even following them. Talk to us a little bit about what that is and what those men need to understand. Maybe what you wish men knew about shadow work.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think this is going to be a fun conversation, especially the angle that you guys are talking about. Look, the shadow is the psychological archetype or the psychological part of you, and everybody has one, where you store all the stuff about yourself that you don't like, that you reject, that you don't want other people to know about, your insecurities, your fears, different pains. But it's also the part of you where you inadvertently store some of the potential gold or power that resides within you. And so, the concept of the shadow was created by Carl Jung, a very famous psychoanalyst, Swiss psychoanalyst in like the 1920s, 1930s. And the basic principle of it was that when we try and deny certain attributes or characteristics within ourselves, those things don't just die away, they become hidden to our consciousness. And then they kind of take on a life of their own. And so I wrote a line in my book that said, your pain has its own intelligence, right? Your pain has its own intelligence. And we don't often think about that. We don't often think about the fact that, the hard shit that we've gone through in childhood, or the bullying that we experienced, the divorce that we went through, that if we don't sort of tend to or understand that pain, it will come back to haunt us in some capacity. And it will live inside of us and wait to strike. And so what a lot of men are dealing with is, with regards to something like self-sabotage, is that they're sabotaging because of this part of them, this powerful insecurity, this powerful fear or worry that they're holding. And so your shadow kind of gets created over the years when you're young and you get bullied or you get ostracized, or, you're worried about not being good enough or tall enough or strong enough or, sexually virulent or potent enough. And slowly, parts of you start to go away from your consciousness. And so to kind of get a sense of this, the guys that are listening to this, you can just ask yourself, like, what do I not like people to know about me? Or what do I not want women to know about me? What do I generally hide from women in relationships? And those types of questions are going to point you towards some of the formation of your shadows, right? You might never bring your anger into a relationship, and so you have terrible boundaries, So I'll stop there because I think I've hopefully said a good amount about like what the shadow can look like.
Absolutely. And Carl Jung was very clear that these needs and desires that you shove into the shadow, they don't just go away. It's very much a starvation process. It's kind of like if you said, well, it is not acceptable that I need calcium, so I will simply never have calcium in my diet ever again. I'm going to take my need for calcium and put it over there in the box. And that's not going to work out very well. Eventually, you'll have massive nutritional deficiencies, bone loss, all kinds of problems. And then what happens is binge behavior takes over, right? You get weak, you get hungry, you have cravings, you start lusting after these things that you need, that you are starving yourself of. And what's fascinating that I've seen, unfortunately, way too many times, especially nice guys, right? We had Dr. Robert Glover on just a few weeks ago. Nice guys take their own sexual desire, the fact that they even have sexual desire, and they stuff it down and they pretend they don't, and they simply starve. I don't even think about sex. I have never thought about sex. I would never do such a thing and sully a woman's, carpets in her clean house by having unclean thoughts in such a manner. But he inside is raging and starving with those desires.
So there's something that stood out to me, Connor, that you said that your pain has an identity, right? So it is based on the assumption that it's almost like a living organism. However, every living organism has to have a purpose. It has to have a drive. What is the drive of that shadow? What is its intention?
Yeah, well, there's a couple different intentions. Jung said that the shadow forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. And so, in that he's kind of alluding to this notion that when we reject our pain, it wants to be integrated, right? It wants to be a part of our life. It wants to be known. It wants to be understood. And so to sort of answer your question more directly, the intentionality of the pain in that moment is to be welcomed back into our identity, that we begin to accept that is an inherent part of us. Like one of the most basic psychological principles that I think most people don't understand is that any type of fracturing psychologically, any type of rejection psychologically is going to create inherent suffering. And so, for example, when you feel anxious, just telling yourself, oh, I freaking hate feeling anxious, I don't want to feel this way, that's going to create more of the anxiety, and that's going to you're going to try and push that anxiety away from your consciousness, which will in turn actually fuel the intensity of that anxiousness, right? So our insecurities want to be welcomed in. I like to give the analogy of like, imagine you are King Arthur standing at the round table, and you have all the knights sitting around the table, and you've got the light knights and you've got the dark knights. And on the one side, it's all of the knights that you talk to, right? It's all the characteristics of you that you like. It's your humor, it's your charisma, it's, your good hair or whatever it is. And on the other side are the parts of you that you dislike, your fear of rejection, maybe your abs or the lack thereof, or whatever it is that you don't like about yourself. The less that you are willing to talk about those or talk to or accept those parts of yourself that you dislike, the more that you embolden them, the more that you actually give them power to interfere and interrupt in your life. And the harder you have to work, the more energy you actually have to deploy to keep them at bay. So the mission in some ways is acknowledging what lives in the shadow and beginning to find a certain level of acceptance of those things. Not that we need to operate from that place, not that we need to just be totally insecure in a relationship, but we have to, at the very least, acknowledge that that's a part of us that we can then begin to work on.
I remember in my graduate school program, as I was going through and becoming a psychotherapist, they ran us through many instances of Carl Jung's guided visualizations or guided meditations, meet various parts of yourself. And of course, that has trickled down through the decades to become more like internal family systems and things like that. And when people hear those techniques, they often think, oh, you're fostering split personalities or hallucinations. But it's very much a guided visualization to meet those facets of yourself. And what's really been interesting to me is a lot of men who go through Jung's guided visualizations to meet their shadow, what they often experience and what they often report is that their shadow is angry. It's a version of themselves that hates the core self because that shadow has been rejected for so long and locked away in a cage. But then once that man learns to visualize accepting that shadow, almost hugging that version of himself, they do begin to integrate. And a lot of his core psychological tension starts to melt away because he can accept, I have these needs. This is why it never felt okay for me to have this need because of this conversation when I was little, because of this hurt. And they begin to integrate and accept. And it's phenomenal to watch the psychological trauma and agony really melt away and see that man free up so much of his psychological energy to then to move forward.
So it's interesting that there's events in your life that will split your persona into these components, in the light and the dark. It's interesting that then has to go through a process of recovery and like reintegration, and some people use the term healing. Now, what is the cause of this split? What is it that will cause this such trauma or division that's going to break you into pieces?
Oh man, I've seen. Well, the worst versions are parents who have personality disorders, parents who punish you and wound you and harm you in various ways and tell you it's not okay to feel X. They scream at you when you want this need, when you have a nurturing need, you need love, you need affection. Definitely any kinds of internet parlance, SA, any kind of bedroom harm, as another term they say, but especially as a child. These desires that are normal, feelings that are normal, but they are cast in a very unrecognizable, unacceptable light. You are bad for desiring X. Then I will put X in a box, and to survive, I will deny X for the rest of my life. But X will eventually consume me because I can't deny it.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there. I mean,
Please.
I think there's really sort of like two primary categories that fuels the creation of the shadow. The first one, and probably the biggest one, is anything that threatens our sense of belonging. We are social creatures, and we come into this world hyper dependent, entirely dependent on our primary caregivers. And so anything that threatens our belonging, right? Say you're a kid and you express anger and your parents really severely punish you, you might learn that your anger isn't welcome or that it's a bad part of you. And so you should entirely, wholesale reject it and try and get rid of it. So that's just an example. But anything that threatens your sense of belonging is fundamentally going to cause you to offload that into your shadow. And then secondly, anything that threatens a sense of authenticity. And so Gabor Mate's got this great saying of, sometimes trauma is when we have to reject something authentic in order to find acceptance as a child, and so that might look like we have a need or a want, and we express that need or want from our parent, and our parent, ignores us entirely. And every time that we ask for that thing, they just ignore us, whether it's physical connection or emotional connection, et cetera. And so we learn on some level, this part of me or this need or this want or this desire doesn't matter. So I'll just reject this authentic part of what I need and want. And this is the foundation of the nice guy, right? Like Dr. Glover and I have talked about this a lot, where we learn to cut off authentic parts of ourselves. And so the reason why for a lot of men, there's sort of two primary things that I've seen that are really dominant in their shadow. The first one, as you were saying, Adam, is their anger. A lot of men learn either through proximity to other men, seeing a dad with really hostile, violent anger. Maybe he was abusive towards, the boy's mom, or abusive towards him verbally, emotionally, or physically, or otherwise. Or you saw a dad who had no spine. He had no backbone. And so you kind of followed unintentionally in his footsteps, and your anger is hidden in your shadow. Nietzsche had a great quote that I included in the book that said, what's hidden in the father will be revealed in the son. What's hidden in the father will be revealed in the son. This sort of notion that we collect the unconscious baggage of our dads, whether we like it or not, because we see we see through proximity, through modeling, what they're doing and what they're not doing and what they're afraid of and what they, where they're sort of screwing up. So anger is the big one. And then the other one is it's very common for men that what Jung would say is that the anima is his unconscious. So his feminine is the unconscious. And so for a lot of men, what happens is that they push their unsavory, unwanted emotions into their shadow. They push their grief into their shadow, their sadness, their anxiousness, all of those things that they would label as being feminine or more womanly get stuffed down into their unconscious, and it can create all kinds of chaos.
Now, there's healthy ways of men to discipline themselves, and that's not necessarily like a harsh shadow. Every guy has some kind of shadow, but the harshest shadows really are what we would spring from, in my parlance, would be attachment theory. When you learn that you will never be loved, and so you have to answer why. I will never be loved because I am unacceptable. Very harsh shadow, nice guy syndrome right there. Or I will never be loved because other people are incapable of love. Therefore, I must hide all of these things from them as well. And I have to buckle down and never feel anything. I can never let go. Avoidant men have very deep shadows, and anxious men have very deep shadows as well. It's fascinating to see those split.
So what's the beginning then of the work of integrating your shadow as part of the attachment work that you do, Adam?
For
Because
me?
we talk about this a lot, right? We talk about how to heal your attachment. Now, there's a lot of steps that come around being honest about your principles. There's a lot of steps that come around being honest about your relationships, your trust, the way you choose to connect with people. But we don't really delve too much into talking about how to integrate those negatives, or at least we haven't yet on this set of podcasts. Mm-hmm. So how does the work that you two gentlemen do connect in the middle in terms of creating this now secure attachment and much more transparent shadow? And I assume the word transparent is applicable here, Connor, because I guess the shadow will never go away. There's going to be things that you are going to be ashamed of, or things that we're going to have to hide, or feel like we at least don't want to disclose them to the world. But it doesn't have to be in complete self-denial, right?
No, it can't be. I see, Connor, you and myself, I see us... I see our work integrating actually seamlessly. So here's how I see it, at least myself. I don't claim to be a shadow work kind of individual, to be honest with you. There's a lot of people that do shadow work. That's not something I specifically claim. What I do with attachment is specifically to give people the vehicle in which they can then even explore that or even begin talking about it. So they come to me, and they were born in a family where they were never given the luxury of having a person that they could open up about those shadow pieces with. So with attachment, first what I help them do is identify, are there human beings on the planet that I could open up and explore the shadow with? And I give them the framework to do that. And then I help them understand that they themselves are not unacceptable, unlovable pieces of garbage, and that they can open up with other human beings. At that point, they begin exploring that shadow. They begin opening up. And that's really a piece where Connor really comes in, of like, who is your shadow? What does it look like? How do you integrate that? And building that in. So again, Connor, I see you and I working in tandem in there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, attachment is a huge part of it. My colleague and friend Dewey Freeman has a saying that we're wounded in relationship and we have to heal in relationship. And so for me, any good therapeutic process is going to bring us back to something relational, whether it's the relationship that we have with ourselves or the relationship that we have with others. And so, it's just paramount. What I would say about being able to heal and integrate the shadow, because I think it's very relatable for the average guy, where it's like, I know I'm screwing up. I know I'm sabotaging my money, my body, my relationship, like whatever it is that, you listening to this conversation are like, I know I'm sabotaging. How the hell do I stop it? Look at the shadow as unexpressed potential. So it's something that you learned early on in life wasn't okay for you to express. Whether it was a sexual desire, whether it was an emotional need, whether it was some type of relational need, it's something that you learned early on in life wasn't okay for you to express. And part of our work is to start to look at a couple of things. Number one, what wasn't okay for me to express growing up? What was I punished for expressing growing up? what did I learn early on in life would get me rejected or was dangerous? For me, being kind of like silly and wild when I was young was actually dangerous. It got me in a lot of trouble. When when I was acting out as a kid, that would what would ensue was physical abuse or verbal abuse of some kind. And so I learned very quickly that type of silly behavior wasn't all right. And there's many different examples of that, right? But we have to start to look at what did I have to reject? And if you're not too sure about that from your childhood perspective, look at it in your adult life. So you could answer some questions like, what do I have to reject in my relationship? What don't I want my partner to know? What am I afraid of being told no for? What do I think is a broken part of me? What do I deem or label as something that's not good about myself, whether it's my anxiousness or it's my anger or what have you. And then it's a process of being able to take the risk of letting people in on the game that exists inside of you. I always say that what has not been witnessed cannot be healed. What has not been witnessed cannot be healed. If nobody knows that you're dealing with this abusive inner critic, this voice inside of you that's just on you constantly and shaming you, you can't actually ever really heal that part. Somebody needs to know, somebody in your life, whether it's a therapist, a coach, a men's group, whatever it is, somebody actually needs to understand what it is that you've been grappling with. Same with anxiousness or sexual desires. And so you have to start to bring some of those things forward in a way that is meaningful, also, relatively safe and secure. You probably don't want to bring some deep, dark secret or trauma forward to maybe a buddy in your life that can't hold or handle that, right? There is such a thing as being too vulnerable too soon or bringing too much out to somebody. So we have to use some discernment, but I'll pause there.
And this right here is where attachment theory then comes in, because it's mandatory at that point to build those frameworks and to understand your relationships. As you reintegrate that shadow into self, who's going to accept you? I had very recently, I had a male client come in who was in his early 60s, been married for a long time, had kids, adult kids. He and his wife had lived together for our whole lives, but he had never felt true happiness, and she had never felt fully connected to him. No affairs, very kind, very ethical, good moral, disciplined people, but complete lack of happiness in both capacity, in both of them. And that was something that he had been doing, is he did a lot of shadow work in himself to understand needs and desires. He had no framework for how to open up with other people. He had no framework for articulating that shadow to the other person and then understanding that it would be received. And that's been the next step as I've worked with him, is how do you even explore and articulate this to your wife? How do you open yourself up so that your cortisol doesn't spike out of control when you try to tell her a need? And then how do you help her receive it properly with her nervous system? Because she's anxiously attached. She has her own challenges that she has to deal with. A lot of men face a lot of shame around their appearance, and not even how they look, but shame to try to make themselves look better. I've heard over and over that a real man is not supposed to care how he looks, but a real man does care how he presents himself to the world. So as you face your shadow, as you face your shame, and as you become the man that you are meant to be, make sure that you look like that man. Rugged Legacy Grooming Supplies is going to help you be the man you've always wanted to be. Whether that's with shave butter or beard balm or beard oil or any of their line of products, you can become the man that you've wanted to be.
So there's a couple of interesting steps here that I think most guys who want to get into shadow work and attachment work run into, and they don't know how to surpass them. So what happens is that they stop or quit or they backtrack. And there's two areas that I've seen in my own journey working with Adam. I've been a client of Adam's for multiple years. Also, going through various work with various psychologists that we've built inside of Veritas, which is our creator incubator. I worked with Jordan Peterson extensively as well. So this is a very familiar territory. But one thing that has jumped out at me is there's two parts. There's the feeling of pity, self-pity, which is very, very toxic for men, in my opinion. Like when a man looks into himself and he sees these parts and he starts feeling bad for himself, he can get caught up in very dark moments, and it's very hard to get out because then he starts seeking, validation, comfort from everybody else, often in unhealthy ways.
I deserve X.
This happened to me in childhood. Look at how I'm suffering. I demand that you take care of me. And they revert back into basically infancy because they're trying to backtrack. So that's one area that a lot of guys will run up against, and they will either fall into that trap or instinctively backtrack and say, I'm not going to talk to you about my feelings because I'm not going to sit there and pity myself. Right, I'm not going to sit there and just, whine and complain and bitch about how I had such a hard life. And that's kind of one area. Now, the second area is that we're also kind of bound by the realities of life. It's really nice if you can have the capacity to sit there for 2 months under a tree and meditate and, figure out everything that's wrong with you, but that's not the case, right? Many times people only start this work when they have children, when they have, families, when they have work. And I compare it to trying to fix an airplane mid-flight. It's like, your wing is like, half hanging off and your engine's kind of messed up. So you got to crawl out, duct tape it together in the air and hope it holds until the next landing type of thing. So there's balance between not being able to complain or wanting to complain, but also recognizing that you have a limited amount of resources you can afford to spend on this are the two things I find hold men back from getting the right help, or at least taking the right steps. How do you guys suggest that men overcome these barriers?
I mean, I would break this down to hopefully something quite simple, which is either confront your laziness or confront your fear. I have a firm belief that there is no change, no transformation, no growth, no evolution without confrontation. Like any type of growth requires some type of confrontation. And confrontation doesn't mean that you have to be aggressive or violent. It simply means that you are moving towards something that is challenging, that you're afraid of. And normally, usually, that means that you are going to be developing some type of competency. So what I usually tell men is, what do you feel incompetent in? And that might be emotional communication in their relationship. It might be some type of sexual proficiency. Maybe they don't feel very confident within the bedroom. It might be around finances or their body, whatever it is. And I'll say, okay, you feel insecure in this area, you're afraid of rejection, we're going to confront that fear. We're going to actually move towards it actively through a very simple, slow step plan, right? Where it's like, we're going to break this down into something that is bite-sized so it doesn't feel like a gargantuan task, right? Because a lot of guys are like, I want to get married and have kids. And then they focus on that and they're terrified of all the small steps that come in between. So confront laziness, confront fear, get very clear on where you're lazy, what you're afraid of, and start to move towards confronting those pieces, and do it in relationship, right? Have people that are in your corner that know you, that are supporting you, holding you accountable, not holding your hand, but checking in on you. I think those pieces are incredibly, incredibly important.
But the fear actually is something I wanted to also dive into it, because it's often a protective mechanism. And one thing that I do know about the shadow, especially if one that's been denied for a long time, is exactly as Adam, you've said, it's very, very angry. Mm-hmm. And what it's going to try to do, if you let it loose, it is going to try to claw back more than is necessary, right? So it may lash out in very angry ways and very, kind of unstable ways. And when a man is looking backwards at his shadow and he's trying to give it a voice, there has to be an element of restraint, because you start working on it. You can't snap on your kids because you're angry. You cannot snap on your wife because you're angry. Like, you cannot lash out and express it by running around punching things, right? There's a restraint, a fear of the shadow itself, because we understand that deep, dark-rooted power that it has, and we're naturally afraid of it because we're also trying to protect others from ourselves. So how do you then build a structure where you can work through the shadow, by not being lazy, I agree, but also with the constraints of time, with the constraint of resources, but with the also caution that has to come with that type of work, especially if you're around, family, if you're around friends, around coworkers. You can't take the time away and go to a men's group where that's a lot easier.
Yeah, a creature that's starving will try to feast.
Right.
Is what you're saying. So what I have found often is... at least in my work, and Connor, I'll turn this over to you after this, but in my work, it is helping the man understand where he can feast appropriately without harming others. Especially what's really interesting is teaching a man where he can reciprocally feed others while he is feasting, rather than feasting upon somebody, feasting with somebody. So a big piece for married men that I work with is helping them to understand that their desire for closeness actually is mirrored with their wife's desire for closeness.
That's a hard one for people
to
get.
It is. It's just that you draw your sense of closeness and your oxytocin bonding and your serotonin release. You draw them at different points, maybe during the bedroom act, for example, where she draws a lot of her closeness in the earlier phases of it that then culminates in the later phase. And it has to begin emotionally and then non-sexually and then move into a sexual capacity. You may, when you're starving, only really feel like you're feasting during the physical act. But what you need to learn is that you can begin feasting with the emotional act. You can begin feasting with the non-sexual act. Then moving into the culmination of that feast in the sexual act, you can actually begin feasting together pretty substantially, where men start to enjoy the foreplay, where men start to enjoy the emotional intimacy component. But you do have to train them into that and help them understand. Otherwise, they run out there with all the subtlety of a Viking attack, and they try to, scoop their wife up from the kitchen when she's doing dishes and toss her on the bed, and she's not having it. You need to teach them how to feast mutually and how to feast carefully and appropriately. Connor, what are your thoughts on that? And have you experienced similar with your clients?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll just say I love the analogies that you guys and the metaphors you guys keep bringing in. I feel like I'm not a metaphor person, but I always appreciate them because it's not something that I've developed. So I think those are great. Here's what I would say: perfectionism is the nutrition of the shadow, and many of us are serving that up to it. And so perfectionism and punishment are inextricably linked. You cannot have an aim of perfection without punishing yourself either towards that unachievable goal or after you don't achieve that unachievable goal. And so a lot of the times when guys are trying to change, when you're trying to put in a new habit, or you're trying to deal with this, the shadow that we've been talking about, or a lapse in connection with your partner, or whatever it is, what can often happen is we put these unrealistic expectations on ourselves, and we do not start with where we are and what we have. And so we have to be able to relinquish perfectionism, because perfectionism is just a recipe for self-punishment. And that for me was the biggest challenge. When I started doing this work, I was like, I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. and I'm going to journal for 30 minutes, and then I'm going to meditate, and then I'm going to cold shower, and then I'm going to do this. And I had this 2-hour routine that I could never do, and it was so aggravating. But it just became this reason, the next reason for me to shit on myself, for me to feel like, I'm never making progress, I'm never moving forward. And so we have to begin with what we have, what we can do, and what's actually manageable. So, if you're super busy and you're a dad and you've got 3 kids and a wife, and, you've got a business that you're running, or a very, you've got a career that you're committed to, you probably don't have as much space as you want. So begin where you can. If you know that you can carve out 30 minutes in the morning before everybody's up to work out and journal, start with that. And that will probably be enough of a challenge. If you know that you can, schedule a 30-minute sit down with your wife to have some of these hard conversations and say, here's what I've been grappling with, or here's what I really want to, explore more of in the bedroom with you. How do you feel about that? Are you open to that? Do that, right? Start with the thing that seems the most accessible to you in the moment, right now, right here, and go do that.
Yeah, but a lot of this also, perfectionism comes from pride, right? You say, I am a strong man who desires and will be this. And there's a misunderstanding of the learning process. There's often a misunderstanding of the fact that that learning is not linear, that you actually are going to have a steep adoption period followed by a drop-off. Skills are not learned in a way that you just continually to get better and better and better. You become infatuated with an idea. You implement this 2.5-hour strict regimen. You will follow it for a couple of weeks. You will actually learn many things from that period. And then as you start internalizing that a change, as you start actually properly processing that, it is going to become harder and harder and harder. So stepping back when you cannot continue and actually decreasing the amount of intensity and then increasing it again, kind of this interval style training of your psyche is a very natural process.
I want to challenge that idea that you just laid out, that perfectionism is born of pride. I think it's often born also of fear or panic. It's often born of the craving not to be seen as imperfect, because if you are, you'll be an imposter. And not, again, for an arrogance, but as if I am seen as an imposter, then I will be crushed. I think that perfectionism can be a form of self-defense. So if it's pride, then we definitely need to challenge that, and I need to look at that. Am I being prideful? And the other piece is, am I trying to defend myself from a phantom threat? Is the other answer. Like, who am I trying to be safe from? Who am I trying to not be seen by? Who am I trying to not be crushed or stomped on by? That is a very important question when we navigate the shadow, is, not only, what am I hiding, but who am I hiding it from? And is it even serving a purpose anymore to hide it from them? Maybe I couldn't show my silliness to my mother or my father as a child, but who now am I hiding my silliness from? How might they react? Am I actually, perhaps, could it be, am I starving my wife and my child because they crave to see that silliness from me? And I myself am observing a strange, arbitrary rule that actually is in opposition to the reality of what people want from me.
I think in my experience, shame is the propellant of perfectionism. Perfectionism is an attempt to outrun. One of the biggest things that I've seen within men is that most men are very unaware of the shame that they carry in their life. And it's one of the furthest things from us. I start working with a man and getting into his day-to-day experience of how he feels and what's going on in his life and how he feels about his life. At the bottom of all of it, and what's usually the furthest away from his consciousness, is shame. I'm ashamed that I'm not enough. I'm ashamed that I don't belong. I'm ashamed that I haven't become more successful. I'm ashamed that I'm not living up to, who I thought I would be, or what I thought I would do right now, or what my parents wanted me to do, or what my dad accomplished that I've never been able to achieve. And so shame is a very powerful force in a man's life. And what I have seen time and time again is that shame can often be something that we deploy as men to try and motivate ourselves towards goals or achievements or success. And I call it dark motivation or shame-based motivation. And it lives in our shadow. And for a lot of us, what ends up happening is that we can actually produce some pretty wild shit by using that fuel of shame, but it will always come at a cost, and it will always run out. And at some point, what happens for the majority of men is that they get to a place in their life where they've achieved some success and they feel hollow and empty. And what's left is this deep well of grief and shame that they've never addressed. And so they have to start to use a different motivator. And so, I think for me, perfectionism is this attempt to outrun the burden of the shame that we've been carrying from, whatever that experience was. And this isn't to demonize shame. Shame in our youth keeps us safe, right? It's a behavioral change mechanism. And we see this culturally today, which I think is, I'll just say it outright, I think it's disgusting, the way that people use shame on social media to try and correct behavior, right? We try and deploy shame to correct behavior, and it does not work. We do it individually and we do it socially, and it produces a very net negative outcome.
So here's an interesting thing. A big source of shame in culture actually comes from religion. And, there's a lot of cases where, especially for people in organized religion, and I'm actually Orthodox Christian myself, so I see this too very heavily in our church, and this specifically says these things are sinful. Sexual relationships, anger, desire, all these things are projected as sin. Now, I think they're often misconstrued, and that those teachings are not properly presented, which can still cause a lot of problems. Do you think that, as a Catholic, Adam,
no, we have no guilt at all in the Catholic
zero
Church.
Guilt.
Zero. No, there's no shame at all.
That's good. I'm glad. Whew. Okay, well, that makes one of us. Go ahead.
No, yeah, it's we even if we're getting into religion, the term sin itself In America, we don't usually know what that comes from. It means like you are bad, to do something evil, right? And the term sin itself is an old English archery term, which means to miss the mark. You have missed the mark. So correct your aim, and next time aim better is ideally the goal there. But in America, we have this from the Great Awakening, we have sinners in the hands of an angry God, which is an actual book that you can pick up and read. That was a revitalization of American faith, and we have this idea that we ourselves are hated by our core Creator. And that often resonates with people who felt hated by their parents.
Sure.
And that resonates
by
deeply
community. Like I spoke to a lot of
community.
Protestants, and one of the most harmful things they've told to me they've experienced as children is when their parents or their I guess it's not priests but like pastors, there we go, came to them and said, well, you have done something so bad, I am no longer convinced that you are saved. And I was go, whoa, that's exceptional. That is some serious accusations you got going on there. And I could see how that was damaging.
Well, and unfortunately, many times it's not only I'm not convinced you are saved, but I actually firmly believe that you are unsaved and you are a disaster, and we need to now shun you from the rest of the tribe.
Right.
The shunning shame is absolutely. Yeah.
So Connor, I don't know if you delve into religion and what is kind of your perspective on the role of that spirituality, and especially conversations around sin and adherence to religious principles. You brought up sexuality as a great example. Sex before marriage, the desire for things, the desire for sexual connection, even natural desires, desire for food, greed, all these things that are part of the human experience. How do you see that playing into this idea of shadow work, and how do the men you coach typically go through this?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a lot of men who have grown up in many different religions, right? LDS, Catholic, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, sort of the gamut. But there are some that are certainly more shame-based, that deploy shame specifically as a means of trying to have the individuals that follow that religion ensure that they adhere to a certain behavior. And this is what I was saying before, which is that when you try, just again, as a basic psychological principle, when you try and deploy shame as a means of behavioral control, you will naturally and inevitably create some type of behavior that is unwanted. Okay? So there's a cost to using shame as a behavioral coherence mechanism, because it's not real. You're not doing it from a place of love or compassion. You're not doing it from a place of betterment. You're doing it from a place of self-flogging. And anytime that you deploy shame in that manner, you need to cope with the weight of that psychologically. And I think that there's different forms of religions that, have really instilled a very deep level of shame within the people that are within those communities. Not always. It's not like it always happens for every single person. But I think that a lot of people come out of those experiences, and how they have tried to move themselves towards being a better father, being a better husband, being a better leader is through the vehicle of shame. And they are stuck in these patterns that keep them depressed, that keep them anxious, that keep them in fear, that keep them disconnected from their spiritual belief, their God. And I think in many ways, a good priest or pastor is meant to act in some ways as almost like what a good psychologist or therapist is doing, right? Is that it's a good psychologist or therapist is there to help you as an individual repair the relationship with the self and with the self that's outside of you, whether you want to call that life, nature, God, universe, source, etc. And a pastor or a priest is meant to do the same thing, right? Is to help you guide you to having the relationship with the self outside of you and the self within you. And so For me, shame is just, it's a natural experience. It's a natural occurrence that we can learn how to work with and use because in many ways, like I said, it happens to keep us safe when we're young, when we're trying to connect, but it's never something that we should deploy actively as a means of trying to get people to behave the way that we want.
And this is, people always ask me, Adam, why would you, a man of like core science, why would you go become a Catholic at the age of 33? Why would you do that? And it's a fair question. To me, it was a place to really face and overcome that shadow continuously. So, I'm not perfect. I'm almost 40.
Really?
Yeah, I'm almost 40. I've committed about 5 sins in my life. And to me, it was the model of religious faith as an AA model of like, look, we're all in recovery. We're all going to relapse. We're all going to mess up. When you do, you get in here, you talk about it. So we have reconciliation, what people mostly would call confession. You go in, you walk in, you look like a hangdog kind of look. You're ashamed. Your shadow, my shadow overtook me. I did it again, right? You walk in, and the priest waiting, and you stand outside the confessional. Sometimes we're very informal. And he goes, hey, come on in. You look like you need it. And you walk in, he sits down, and he does his thing. And we have a whole ritual where you talk to him, and you say, look, this is what I did. This is why I think and he'll ask, well, why do you think you did that? And you talk through it. You talk through what was your shadow. And what's cool about all the priests that I've worked with is they say, well, why do you think you did this? Well, what was the gap? What were you not tending to that maybe you needed? Or where were you, not like, what did you do wrong? But what fell through for you? How did you not nurture yourself?
Right. So one thing that we've actually, I think, lost largely in society, and men like Connor are actually trying to build back, is the mentorship component. Before, a lot of this was done with your priest, right? He was your resident psychologist. You did exactly that.
If he was good.
If he was good, but still, he was supposed to do exactly that. He was supposed to guide you from a young age. I believe confession started, at 7?
Yes.
Like ish?
Yeah, my son just had his very first.
So there you go. So starting from the age of 7, you had somebody who, like on a weekly, maybe a monthly basis or whatever it is, guide you through these inner workings and help you, exactly as you said, Connor, talk to somebody. Now, religion kind of fell out. Then there was different branches of Christianity that happened within Protestantism and non-denominational that had their own approaches to that. Some talked about it, some did not. Then we went very secular for very many years. And all of a sudden, we also lost our communities, because before, when it wasn't religion, it was what? It was your coworkers, it was your family members who were males, right? Your uncles, maybe your siblings who are older than you. Maybe you had some removed relatives. Your apprentice. A lot of people went to apprenticeship models. They would become a blacksmith's apprentice, and they actually built a relationship, a mentorship relationship with an older male who could track your progress. Like somebody who kind of is like, hey, like what do we do with the Veritas, right? We have a bunch of younger employees, 20, 25, and we mentor them as well. Say, what's going on with you? You look a little down. You're a little bit behind at work. What's happening in your life? Talk to us through these things. I've noticed this. I've noticed that. But many people actually many men do not have that mentorship. They do not have the support structure. They do not have the framework. They got nothing, like nothing at all. So in terms of how to rebuild that, how do you even start, Connor, when you have none of those support structures?
Yeah, I think, to your point, we have to be able to verify the problem first, right? So we have a real absence of male role models. You have 1 in 4 kids growing up without a father figure. You have young men who are going to enter into the school system where it's anywhere between 70 and 90% of female teachers. Then, you go out into college where, again, it's female dominated in colleges now. If you try and find a therapist or a psychologist, right, 70 to 80% of therapists and psychologists are female. And so you can go to all of the sort of traditional places. I think church is maybe a little bit different from that because there's a lot of groups that are led by men. But for the most part, you can go through and be raised up as a young man in today's society with 0 male role models or influences in your life, which is damaging because you need some type of modeling, right? Masculinity is something that is transmitted, right? Masculinity is something that's transmitted. It is passed down, and it's transmitted through modeling. You see how your father treats your mother when he's angry or frustrated, or you see how he treats her when maybe she's pissed off. And you learn how to treat women, how to speak to them, how to, navigate their emotions. And so in the absence of witnessing that transmission of masculinity, you have to find spaces and places where you can begin to receive some of that transmission, whether it's a church environment, whether it's a men's group. I think we've kind of relegated some of this stuff to like sports leagues, which is an adjacent thing, which can be great. There's a certain type of transmission of masculinity that can happen there. And I grew up playing hockey until I was 20 and then played in the beer leagues. And so, I advocate for that, but there's a different depth of masculinity and male modeling that we need to see. And so, for a lot of men, I say, start a men's group or join one, whether it's religious or not, maybe it's secular, and you start to practice being in relationship and building a secure attachment with other men. Because if you can express yourself and your emotions and your fears and your wants and needs and desires with the men in your life, you will have put the reps in to do it with the women in your life. And so it's a very, I would say, just start there. Whether you build your own men's group or you join one is irrelevant, but start with that and start with the intentionality of grappling with maybe even defining and discerning what masculinity is, right? Maybe you grew up in an environment where there was an absence of masculinity, and so you've never really understood what it looks like. And so you've kind of been caught in the shadow of masculinity on YouTube and going down the rabbit holes of following guys that maybe do not embody the type of masculinity that is actually going to serve you or serve mankind.
Where are we going as a society with this? Are we going to then bring back some form of centralized universal masculinity? Or are we going to continue splintering off into these little mini tribes, and what's going to happen with us after?
I think we're in a rebirth, to be honest with you. I think that I think a lot of the red pill movements and all the various pill movements and everything on Twitter and all of that, I think that's a juvenile masculinity that's trying desperately to emerge from the shelter of over-powerful women who have kept society alive and have run our families for a long time as the men have died. But I think we're emerging from that juvenile, look at me, look at my muscles, look at my Bugatti, into a, who am I next? What am I designed for? Why, right? Masculinity springs from personal sovereignty, but it finds its fulfillment in service and in mission and in care for others, in advancing the cause of others and nurturing through strength, through power, nurturing. Not feeding with milk, but even feeding with blood, right? You give your blood for your children continuously, and you hallow the ground for them to move forward and build. I think that is where masculinity finds its fulfillment. And I think that men have grown into personal sovereignty, but I think that we are now stepping forward into responsibility.
What do you think, Connor?
It's a tough thing to guess. I think that AI is going to continue to fracture our collective consciousness. And I think that we're going to see more fracturing, more division, more polarization, more splitting. But I do think that there is a chance that men begin to band together more coherently. And I see it happening online where, there's more men's groups popping up. There's more channels and content for men that are popping up supporting men. And in part, a lot of them are saying very similar things, which I think the archetypal father of Jordan Peterson's kind of spearheaded for a lot of young men, right? Like, I think the reason why he became so popular was he represented the archetypal father that a lot of men just didn't have, right? Make your bed, stand up straight with your shoulders. I mean, just like stupidly basic things. And so I do think that a lot of men are starting to come together and support one another. But I fear that, that AI, that the political division within our countries is going to continue to exacerbate the issue unless we collectively sort of pull our head out of our ass and say, let's continue to come together as men, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of your sexual orientation. I don't give a shit about any of those things if you are willing to be focused in on being a better version of yourself as a man and supporting somebody cross-border, cross the political lines, et cetera. And so I don't know how that'll play out. That's my general hope. That's my mission. Is I work with everybody from every walk of life. I do not care, where you grew up, what country you grew up in, what your political affiliation is. If you are looking at bettering yourself as a man, then my work is for you.
Well, one thing that I really liked from my work with Jordan Peterson, and I was his executive director for 4 years, and we built his brand and really built his kind of entity together with the team that we had. It was the passion and it was the absolute commitment to come out and to talk about these issues, not from the perspective of, he never said that he was right. One thing I really liked about him is never said that he was right. He said, this is what I think, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I feel, and I'm going to go and I'm going to fight and fight and fight and fight so that people can wake up and pay attention. And they ask themselves these hard questions and they have the hard conversations. So that was the breakthrough that happened with him, because he actually stood up and said something. Right now that he's kind of transferred a little bit over to a little bit more of a political side, there is a vacuum. I see that there is actually a vacuum in the space, and there is now a new generation of masculine-focused creators that are coming out. But we're still currently lacking somebody with that type of strong passion, with that type of commitment to go and have these conversations on every news channel, on every podcast, on every platform. And I'm very curious to see how this masculinity movement is going to develop, even from the intellectual creator space, and see who we're going to select as a leader or multiple leaders in this space. Do you have anybody that you particularly like, Connor, or follow, or somebody who you feel can kind of step forward into that role or one of those roles?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's going to be more collective than individual. I think that what's happening now, I think there's a number of men that are in the spotlight. I think people like Jordan Peterson will always have that. Jocko Willink will always have that. But I think you have the younger generation like Chris Williamson on Modern Wisdom, who, I think is not necessarily being a champion of individual masculinity, but more sort of posing some of the questions indirectly. And he's built a huge platform because of that, because he's sort of asking some of these questions indirectly. He's not like me. I'm more blunt force trauma. I'm like, let's talk about these things directly. But I think that whoever it is that rises to the top is going to have that certain level of ferocity that I think JP has, but it's also going to come from a place of deep relationality. It's going to be very much about coherence. How do you as a man maintain and develop coherence within yourself in a time where it seems like everything's falling apart, right? Where it's just complete and utter chaos, politically, financially, et cetera. And so I think those will be some of the tenets of the individual or individuals that rise to the top. But I can't really put my finger on one person or another, because, and the last thing I'll say is, unfortunately, the system that we inhabit promotes polarization. And so you almost have to, and this is what Andrew Tate did, right? He did something very smart in the sense that he would take a fundamental truth about the masculine experience and then couch it in something inflammatory, right? And so it's kind of like this double whammy where it was like, well, here's the truth, here's the inflammatory comment. And that caught everybody, because some people would be talking about the truth. Usually it was some truth about, how men's experiences in the modern day world are very challenging and hard. And then the inflammatory comment would catch the other people that normally wouldn't listen to this, and everybody would talk about it. And then it spread like wildfire. And so I think the challenge is that the men who could be listened to, that other men could really benefit from listening to, don't give a shit about those tactics. They don't want to use some tactic to try and gain public recognition. Maybe that's required. I'm not too sure.
It depends.
But
it really depends, because there's also flows and there's also trends that have to happen. Right now we are in the hyperviral trend, right? This is what's pumping across all channels. Andrew Tate in the masculinity space did begin that trend, and he absolutely commercialized it. And there's a lot of lookalikes that have popped up trying to mimic that. We're probably at the peak of it. I expect there to be a die-off and a return to more kind of bipartisan, stable, deeper content. I think we're actually priming ourselves for it. It's very interesting to me that you've mentioned Chris Williamson, because Adam's been on the Chris Williamson show 4 times. So
he's wonderful. I love talking with that guy.
So what are some of the things that you see developing as a trend, maybe in the masculinity movement, in the healthy, more mature masculinity movement, that's maybe associated with your conversations with Chris, which people can find on YouTube and on the podcasts, but also some other masculine thinkers?
Yeah, I think that Jordan Peterson, to be honest with you, I think he led the way into men desiring masculine thinking and masculine virtue. I don't think maybe Connor, you said he maybe was a father figure. I think maybe he was an uncle figure. I think he kind of pulled men forward into wanting to be intellectual men and wanting to think and wanting to grow. I think Andrew Tate pulled men forward into wanting to be, super jacked and have lots of women and have cars. but he also pulled men forward into ambition again.
And responsibility. And it was interesting to me when we're working with Jordan, like I was, backstage in his shows, and, we'd be standing there together looking out over the crowd, and there were about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 very finely dressed men. Mm-hmm. They really came here, and a lot of them, we talked to them after. They were, truckers. They were, craftsmen of some kind. Some were in business, all over the place. But they actually wanted to come out and embody this persona and become their better selves. That was the beginning of a movement.
I think that Jordan Peterson restored men's desire to be intellectuals. Andrew Tate restored men's desire to have ambition. I don't know that we're going to have one man that's going to lead anything. I look at Rome, the Roman Empire. Once it grew large enough, it fractured off into mini capitals. And I think there will be a number of pockets throughout the web that will pop up. Connor, I've heard over the last 2 months, I've heard everybody talking about you and your name. And Connor, do you know Connor? Yeah, I know Connor. Do you know Connor? You've talked to Connor? Oh, did you hear Connor's show? Did you hear Connor the other day? So I think, Connor, you're going to become one of those mini capitals. I'd like to think I might become a mini capital with attachment. I think that there's a number of men that will become mini capitals, and we will each pull together our own little tribes. But then I think the way that we unify, the way that we appear on each other's shows. I think we had John Delaney on here not that long ago.
The Mind Pump guys.
The Mind Pump guys are fantastic. I love those guys. I'm going to go see them again next month. Mind Pump and their tribe. I think that the way these men will see us, mini capitals, so to speak, the way they see us interacting will merge our tribes, and then they will curate. We will curate for them, and
it's
they
like
will
a
merge.
Council almost. A council of men. I like this.
They will, the men who trust me with attachment will see me talk to Connor, and then they'll say, because I trust Adam, I will trust Connor. And they'll listen to Connor and shadow work and say, this is fascinating. Then they'll see, hopefully, the Mind Pump guys and say, Adam likes these Mind Pump guys. I will listen to them, and they'll get ridiculously jacked, right? Sal is helping me get much fitter. I've been losing weight as the seasons have gone on, hopefully. But then the Mind Pump guys, their audience trusts me. Connor, your audience will trust me. Everybody will trust each other. And I think as we men carry that responsibility.
It's almost like you're building secure attachment.
We are building secure attachment. But I think that this is the way forward, is that men will trust curated leaders who then guide them into new avenues of knowledge. I think that's what men around the world are doing.
But this is also how every society has always repaired itself. Usually, it was a complete slump, at least, until one guy picked up the axe or whatever, the stick, and just charged screaming into battle like William Wallace style. And then usually that guy got clobbered. He just died some horrible death. And everybody said, well, wait a second. He actually had a point, and, he might have been wearing funny clothes or, said weird stuff, but he had a point. And that creates that beginning of a movement. I have never really seen a long-term change be propagated by a single man throughout history. There's always a leader, but then there's always a council that follows him. And the council brings together various perspectives. And one thing that I really like, Connor, about the way that you're structuring yourself, your message, and your brand is that you're very cautious to bring together these different perspectives and say, look, unity right? Unity and community actually are the core aspects of what I am offering through the world. And I don't care where you're from, and I love that. I don't care where you're from. I don't care who you choose to sleep with. I don't care who you choose to vote for. I don't care what you choose to eat. What is the purpose? What is the point of you being here, and what are you trying to accomplish? So this combination of messaging, we're creating a matrix, and I call this the matrix of humanity and a matrix of masculinity in this case, because AI will replace everything that is average. AI is a great creator of the average thing. He's a okay copywriter. He's okay filmmaker. He's an okay whatever you want it to be, because it is the average of the human experience. We now need to become greater than that in order to really stay relevant as creators, as thinkers, as leaders. So what you guys are doing is creating the framework within which this new redefinition of humanity, masculinity, femininity, family, religion, everything is going to play out for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And then who knows what's going to happen. But it's going to be on, season 25 of I Wish You Knew. We'll come back to that topic.
Well, I like Terence McKenna's, just to drop this in, I like Terence McKenna's notion that we need what's called an archaic revival. An archaic revival that, we take old principles that have always been true and served us, and we revive them in ways that speak to our current times, and that is a kind of salve or balm that we can put on the wounds of culture and society that seem to be bleeding out.
Yep. And it's all fantastic. Guys, this has been an awesome conversation. We went from the shadow to how to fix masculinity. I'm actually really excited. A personal goal I have with Veritas is to actually build a masculine kind of community and a masculine conference at the end of this year, 2024, and try to bring together speakers like yourselves and really start creating this framework and the foundation for these discussions. Because I actually agree with Connor. I don't see a leader. We're going to invite Chris to come. We're going to invite Mind Pump to come. We're going to invite you to come, Connor. We're going to invite everybody to come and have these conversations, because that is really the only path forward is going to be through conversation and relationships and community. So I love all of that. Connor, where can people find you? Where can they learn from you? And I heard something about this book of yours, which I actually love the concept of.
Yeah, so the book is called Men's Work. And it really is meant to just be a guide for you to dive into shadow work and all the things that we talked about today. You can find it pretty much anywhere that books are sold, and it's meant to be tactical and practical. So it's not just conceptual. Each chapter has work that you actually dive into, questions, exercises, etc. And then you can find me mantalks.com or mantalks on Instagram and YouTube. It's just pretty much mantalks everywhere.
Awesome. Thank you. Adam?
I am Adam Lane-Smith, the attachment specialist. You can find me on adamlanesmith.com with my coaching, my community, my course, my books, all of my work. You can find me on YouTube and Instagram as @attachmentadam. You're going to find a lot of videos that will guide you forward into your life and into your relationships.
Love it. And you can find me at Andrey Korikov on Instagram. You can also check out the work that I've done with Jordan Peterson, with Adam, with a bunch of other creators inside our Creator Incubator, inside our Creator Academy at veritascreative.media. We actually help build content creators and incubate them, and we're actually looking to incubate a lot more people who will be leaders and creators in the space that we're building, both as masculine and in other domains. So thank you guys for listening. This was I Wish You Knew. We'll see you on the next episode. And in the meantime, please comment your thoughts. We'll be responding in the comments. Subscribe, share, follow us. Hit that ringer button below, because that's really important so you don't miss notifications. And thank you for the time. This has been amazing.